So I'd like to start by thanking the organisers. It's a pleasure to be here and to see such a large and appreciative audience. And I'm obviously not speaking from a personal perspective, but I'd just like to make a few remarks. The announcement by President Trump last year that he had decided to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital has been described as unprecedented. As we remember, it led to protests across the Middle East, and several Palestinians were actually killed. So the final status of Jerusalem has always been one of the most challenging elements in negotiations to resolve the conflict. And Trump's decision highlights, I think, in the starkest terms, the two incompatible realities. On the one hand, the restricted and insecure nature of day-to-day life for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, and on the other, Israel's persistent efforts on the ground to reconfigure the whole of Jerusalem into what it calls its eternal, undivided capital. So I want to talk about these two realities as they've clashed ever more violently and destructively in the period since 1967. As we know, as Rada has said before, the establishment of the State of Israel, the United Nations had, in 1947, agreed to a partition plan to divide what was then British Mandate Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states. And Rada talked about the special status of Jerusalem, so I won't go into that. So when Israel captured the whole of Jerusalem from Jordan, in 1967, it immediately extended the city's municipal boundaries, putting both the east and the west under its sovereignty. Within days of the victory, Israel had annexed East Jerusalem, redrawn and expanded the municipal boundaries, and demolished an entire Arab neighbourhood, which is situated next to the Western Wall, a site which is very significant to Judaism. So Israeli ambitions were clearly articulated soon after the occupation began, when Teddy Kollek, who was then the mayor of Jerusalem, announced in 1968, he said, the object is to ensure that all of Jerusalem remains forever a part of Israel. If this city is to be our capital, then we have to make it an integral part of our country, and we need Jewish inhabitants to do that. His remarks highlighted the determination, even at this early stage, and continued under successive Israeli governments, to establish full control over the city. An ambition, I think, that's hardened over the years, culminating relatively recently in the assertion of the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, that Israel won't become once again a wounded and bisected city. We will forever keep Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty. So the Israeli obsession with Jerusalem was not always so pronounced. In the early days of the state, many of the settlers, the Zionist settlers who were coming in, tended to be secular European, kind of socialist people, motivated more by concerns about nationalism, self-determination, and also escaping from persecution elsewhere than by religion. They weren't so interested in that. And according to Mick Dumper, who's done a lot of work on Jerusalem, he said, Jerusalem was something of a backwater, a regression to a conservative culture that they were trying to move away from. Tel Aviv was the bright new city on the hill, the recapitulation of modernity. However, this changed after the so-called Great Victory of 1967, as Jerusalem became the centre of what Rashid Khalidi calls a cult-like devotion that had not really existed previously. This has now been fetishized to an extraordinary degree as hardline religious nationalism has come to predominate in Israeli politics, and with the Western Wall as its focus. So the legal status of the then 60,000 Palestinians who lived in the areas that became part of Jerusalem arose immediately after the war. According to Israeli sources, in a cabinet meeting on the 11th of June, the day after the war ended, Housing Minister Mordechai Bentov said, "To those who support immediate legislation to annex East Jerusalem, I want to remind them of one thing. We are a democratic country. If there is a law that Jerusalem spreads to all the new territory, the Arab residents of the other part of Jerusalem will become Israeli citizens. So at that time, Minister without portfolio, Menachem Begin, cut him off, not automatically, he said. So East Jerusalem Palestinians remained Jordanian citizens until 1988, when in response to the first Palestinian Intifada, King Hussein cut his country's ties with the West Bank and Jerusalem. Until 10 years ago, few Palestinians applied for Israeli citizenship. It wasn't acceptable. It wasn't necessary. However, as a construction of the wall by Israel, which separates Jerusalem from the West Bank, citizenship applications have risen, although very few people have been successful in obtaining them. So the objective of total Israeli control over the city advanced even further in 1977 with the victory of the ultra-nationalist right-wing Likud party under the same Menachem Begin, which helped to reinforce a new emphasis on Jerusalem as a key element of Israel's identity. What had previously been a mainly European and socialist-leaning population started to become more diverse and also more religious, with Jews coming from the Middle East, North Africa, and elsewhere. And years of uncontrolled development followed, increasing the Israeli presence in East Jerusalem. And as somebody has written, it started to look like a fortress, defended not by walls and ramparts, but by a ring of Jewish-only settlements, apartment buildings, roads, highways. However, although Israel extended its law to East Jerusalem and claimed it as part of its sovereign territory, no country in the world recognized this move until, of course, recently the United States. And they cite law to say that an occupying power does not have sovereignty in the territory it occupies. In 1980, Israel passed a law making its annexation of East Jerusalem explicit. The so-called Jerusalem law asserts that Jerusalem, complete and united, is the capital of Israel, but it's been described as a hollow sovereignty. Using a series of measures that involve substantial land grabs, the rapid construction of settlements, and the imposition of a repressive system of laws on the Palestinian community designed to inhibit their daily life and actually force them out of the city. The Israeli state has managed over the years to change the demographic makeup of occupied East Jerusalem. So today, 86% of East Jerusalem is under the direct control of Israeli authorities and Israeli settlers. Around 200,000 settlers live in settlements that have been mostly built on either entirely or partially on private Palestinian land. Of that number, 2,000 settlers live in the midst of Palestinian neighborhoods under army protection. Based on the law in the West Bank, the state is only allowed to expropriate private land for public Palestinian needs. However, Israeli law uses this law to compensate private land for building Jewish-only settlement roads connected with each other and connected with Israel. And apparently recently Israel unveiled plans for a new settlement housing in the Palestinian neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, a move that has prompted mass protests by activists. Peace Now and other groups condemned the plans. In a statement they said, the government is brutally attempting to destroy the possibilities of the two-state solution. And this time it is by establishing a new settlement in the heart of a Palestinian neighborhood in East Jerusalem and promoting nearly 1,800 housing units beyond the Green Line. The eviction of Palestinian families who are protected tenants in order to establish a new settlement in Sheikh Jarrah shows that nothing will get in the way of settler groups and pro-settler government from preventing a future compromise in Jerusalem. So, Now, I was going to talk a little bit about everyday life for Palestinians living in Jerusalem. It's been described as a strange half-existence, rarely in direct conflict with Israel, but resolutely clinging on to their Palestinian identity, obviously very important. Allowed special Israeli residency permits, Palestinians residing in Jerusalem enjoy advantages over those in the occupied West Bank, but many feel their future in the city is not secure. They say discrimination overshadows their lives, for example, restrictions on building, renovations, disregard by the municipality, even though they pay taxes, bureaucratic obstacles if they marry Palestinians from elsewhere, confiscation of their papers, revocation of their residency rights if they take residency or citizenship in another country, or spend more than 7 years abroad. So their lives are very, very, very restricted and constricted. Israel has allowed the Palestinians of East Jerusalem to remain, but it's hemmed them in, squeezed them, left them in no doubt that the city is no longer theirs. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers have been allowed or encouraged to move to the occupied east of the city, an area the Palestinians hope to establish as their capital of their future state. So, I won't go into detail about the lives of the Palestinians living in that area. Maybe someone else will talk about it. So I'll just go to the conclusion actually now. Last June, which was an article in Haaretz noted that 50 years after the Six-Day War, East Jerusalem's Palestinians remain prisoners in their city. The newspaper cites a recent study in which Dr. Amnon Ramon of the Jerusalem Institute for Policy Research analyses the irregular hybrid status of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. He shows how ambivalent policies, narrow interests, and unwillingness to decide and denial of the problem have created a status that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Native-born residents who are not citizens of the state in whose capital they live. Israeli practices in Jerusalem, as Walid Salem argues, have the characteristics of neo-colonial acts. They're designed to be humiliating to Palestinians. First of all, because they were forced to abandon their own national institutions and join the institutions of the occupier, and at the same time were not given the same rights as Israelis, with the justification that Palestinian Jerusalemites are not citizens of Israel. So in my view, Israeli policies of exclusion and marginalisation are likely ultimately to be counterproductive. President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel has merely contributed to a highly unstable situation. Thank you.